From the perspective of stylistic analysis, these splendid ritual objects of Bronze Age China have a very distinctive, recognizable visual vocabulary. We can recognize them as belonging to this period in China's art history by the extraordinary animal designs and patterned complexity that shows up again and again in work of jade, of stone, wood, and bronze. The iconography presents a fabulous bestiary of animals that must have been associated with some kind of symbolic power, but there are no settled interpretations of specific meanings. We can infer that they were meant to be seen up close because their detailed, intricate patterns of tightly knotted lines demand close viewing. And this, one of the most important elements of the visual vocabulary at this time is the Tao Te, a symmetrical composition that resembles possibly a dragon with its eyes, its snout, its fang, its legs with claws. And we see that this is part of a centralized, symmetrical figure that is built out of squared spirals. They are the elemental vocabulary, the alphabet, if you will, of Shang and Zhou dynasty art. They are called thunder pattern, and they create this sense of a kind of complicated movement. So the way these bronze objects look, their visual style, is important, though not fully understood. Also important is the way they were made, the technique used to produce the bronze objects. Shang dynasty artisans used what's called the piece mold production technique. When you learned about the Chola dynasty bronze casting, you saw in the video The Story of India, A Golden Age, you saw a different technique, not the piece mold technique, but lost wax casting. Chinese artisans knew that method as well and did sometimes use it, but preferred the piece mold technique, which is actually harder. So why did they use it as their go-to technique? So go back for a moment to the beginning of the textbook section, Bronze Age China, where they inserted this special focus side note on technique. And I had told you initially, well, skip past this, we'll come back to it. So you have to read this carefully because they're describing step by step something really complex and technical. The gist of it is that the bronze is made out of a clay model. So you begin by making a model of the object you want, you dry it, and then you have to then make a second mirror image of the model, basically to create a space where you can pour the molten, that is liquid metal, right? So you have this framework of clay pieces that provide the shape, the outer shape and the inner shape. And the metal pours into the in-between places. So by in-between places, I mean you have this kind of pouring channel, right? A pouring duct called a sprue. So they explain how the molten bronze was poured into the mold. And then they say when the metal cooled, the mold was broken apart to reveal a bronze copy of the original clay model. I don't like their use of the term broken apart because it doesn't tell you why they're doing this method. They don't have to break it apart. They can take it apart and retain these clay pieces to make more using the same mold. So if you can save those clay components to remake additional replicas of the same bronze object, you get more. You get the prestige value of quantity. So I'm showing you two diagrams here. One is from the tomb of Fu Hao, who you saw already. And these are archaeological diagrams showing the kind of bronzes that they found. And the diagram records how they were arranged when they were found. This diagram records ritual vessels from the tomb of the Marquis Yi of Zheng. This is 1,000, almost, not quite, but it's hundreds of years later. And notice how we have repetition of the exact same object. More and more, this became desirable. Bronze was a sensitive material, a power material. It was a weapons material. The ruling class monopolized it. So this kind of repeated wealth measured in precious materials in your tomb was a display of splendor. It was part of a culture of ostentatious, competitive display. And we start to get hordes of ritual objects buried apart from tombs. So now you're getting tombs filled with grave goods, and then there's your extra treasure chest full of stuff for your afterlife buried alongside it. And this race for conspicuous consumption really picks up towards the end of the Zhou dynasty. Let me pause here to say that the Shang dynasty was overtaken by the Zhou dynasty. But culturally speaking, there is real continuity. We don't think of these as two different cultures. We think of them as two different sets of power families where their families are vying to control each other's fiefs, a small territory. When you have moments in history where there's lots of little kings, they're always battling to see who can be the big king. So the Zhou dynasty lasts from 1050 to 256 BCE. But what I want you to understand is in that shift from the Shang dynasty to the Zhou dynasty, the bronze making system, the bronze production system, really came to emphasize modular production in a workshop system. And we could call this the beginning of mass production. So it's often said in the West that Henry Ford, with the Ford assembly line, automobile production, invented mass production, but no, it was invented in the Zhou dynasty in 700 to 500 BCE, where you start to get standardized parts or interdependent units that are used to create a complex structure, right? So there was a very wonderful art historian who kind of started thinking about this by comparing this Shang dynasty ritual vessel. Now, it is very symmetrical. Okay, so it's left side, right side, repeats the thunder pattern, the squared spirals. But if you look at it really, really closely, and I know it's hard on the video from the PowerPoint, but they're not actually perfectly matched. You can tell that each piece was done by hand. And then that scholar noticed this particular basin that's in the Smithsonian's Freer Gallery of Art, and realized that he had seen the exact same bronze in another museum and matched them, and they matched identically because they were using a modular system of production, not hand production, every detail of the surface, but a production of clay stamps and clay molds. So the idea here is bronze equals prestige. They're getting more elaborate and complicated. So we're getting a demand for large quantities. And by the Zhou dynasty, these vessels are being mass produced in modular systems.